What you can and cannot do with copyright-protected works. Copyright law changed in 2012, and educators need to know their new rights and obligations. New users' rights found within the Copyright Act allow educators to use copyright-protected works for educational purposes, subject to certain limitations, without having to get permission or pay copyright royalties. Complying with copyright law is important because if copyright is infringed, educators and their employers can be held legally responsible. This presentation is focused on assisting instructors with copyright compliance. It describes two users' rights. It also reviews the procedure instructors must follow when permission to use a copyright-protected work is required. One of the most important users' rights in the Copyright Act is called fair dealing. That is, the fair use of copyright-protected works without permission or payment. Note that fair dealing does not allow for unlimited use. Fair dealing for educational purposes is limited to short excerpts. Fair Dealing Guidelines, or FDG, were developed by Canada's leading education associations to help instructors by describing when copyright-protected works can be used without permission or payment. The FDG describes a safe harbor. The guidelines describe limits within which, according to legal counsel, using copyright-protected works can be legally defended as fair dealing. Let's review the 7 points to the Fair Dealing Guidelines. Educators may communicate and reproduce short excerpts from a copyright-protected work for the purposes of research, private study, criticism, review, news reporting, education, satire, and parody. Copying or communicating short excerpts from a copyright-protected work for the purpose of news reporting, criticism, or review should mention the source and, if available, the name of the author or creator of the work. A single copy of a short excerpt from a copyright-protected work may be provided or communicated to each student as a class handout, as a posting to a learning or course management system that is password protected or otherwise restricted to students, or as part of a course pack. The 4th point in the Fair Dealing Guidelines describes the term short excerpt. In the opinion of legal counsel, a short excerpt includes up to 10% of a work, a chapter of a book, or an article from a periodical. A short excerpt is also described in several other ways. Note that an instructor is not required to select the most restrictive option. Please review the Fair Dealing Guidelines after this presentation. It is prohibited to copy or communicate multiple short excerpts from the same copyright-protected work with the intention of copying or communicating substantially the entire work. If copying or communicating a work exceeds the limits in these Fair Dealing Guidelines, refer the work to a supervisor or other person designated by the educational institution for a fair dealing evaluation. Any fee charged by the educational institution for communicating or copying must only be intended to cover the costs of the institution. Another significant user's right involves the use of Internet materials. For educational purposes, both instructors and students can save, copy, communicate, and perform materials that are publicly available on the Internet. There are limitations and conditions. One important condition is the fact that the Internet material used must have been posted with permission of the copyright owner. The instructor must not know or suspect that the material was made available without the consent of the copyright owner. There are many new users' rights available for educators. Take the time to get more information and become familiar with your rights and limitations. Educational institutions have staff who are responsible for copyright compliance. Copyright go-to people have different titles and positions in post-secondary institutions and are usually located in the library, the legal department, the print shop, or the bookstore. If the intended use of a work falls outside the user's rights provided by the Copyright Act, or if there is some uncertainty about the use, then it is important to consult the copyright go-to people for guidance. Instructors and staff are responsible for copyright compliance and must follow the institution's copyright permission procedure to avoid risk of copyright infringement. If permission is required, it must be obtained in writing from the copyright owner before using the material. If payment is required, it too must be made in advance. Instructors and staff need to know their copyright users' rights and limits. If there is any doubt about the use of copyright-protected work, the institution's copyright go-to person must be consulted before the material is used.